They say some families are blessed, others cursed. But in Ashwick, no one ever questioned which the Talloways were. For nearly 2 centuries their story had wound itself through the village like a black ribbon, frayed, knotted, impossible to untangle. Every heir to the Talloway estate, without fail, met a brutal and untimely end before the age of 30. It was not war that claimed them, nor famine, nor plague, no enemy blade, no sickness of the lungs, no fever of the blood. The curse bore only their name, as though stitched into the marrow of their bones. The villagers whispered of it in taverns after ale, muttering when they thought no ears would carry their words to the estate. They called it the Talloway Doom, and as the years dragged on, generation after generation, the pattern never broke. Sons buried before fathers, brides left widowed before their wedding beds had cooled, daughters fading in the quiet of their chambers, their skin pale as candle wax. It became an inheritance heavier than land or silver, a sentence passed down with every birth. By the mid-19th century, the estate had dwindled to 2 brothers, Elias the elder, tall and proud, and Simon the younger, quieter, and shadowed by frailty from birth. Their parents had gone long before. The father was found broken at the foot of the estate's western tower stairs, the mother fading from grief within the year. The Talloway name remained only in these 2, both still in their 20s, both marked by the same invisible hand that had guided their ancestors into early graves. Ashwick itself lay cradled in the valley beneath the moors, a place of damp stone cottages, low smoke, and endless mist. To live there was to live with secrets pressed into your skin, whether you sought them or not. Children were raised with tales of the Talloways, told to keep from wandering near the estate at night. Lovers walked the moor paths but never passed the iron gates of the manor, and yet for all the fear that name inspired, none could look away. The estate itself was a ruin and a monument, both blackened timbers, crumbling wings that sagged toward the earth, ivy clawing its way up cracked stone. Yet even in decay, it commanded. From the village, one could look up on any day and see its silhouette against the mist, like a wound that refused to heal. The brothers lived within it, their lives unraveling in silence. Elias walked the halls with restless energy, unable to escape the weight of what loomed before him. At night, he paced beneath the portraits of their ancestors, men and women painted in finery, their gazes too knowing, too alive. "We'll not fall like them," he would mutter, his voice echoing through the cold corridors. "We'll not bend to fate." Simon, on the other hand, retreated inward. He was often found in the library, where mold crept along the spines of ancient tomes and dust thickened the air. He spent hours tracing family records, studying parish notes, the brittle pages of old diaries, hunting for some reason, some flaw, some fracture that might explain why death had clung so faithfully to their line. His cough worsened in the damp, but he persisted. He believed that if the truth were ever written, it would be hidden in those pages. The villagers spoke of them with pity and unease. To see Elias ride through the village was to see a man fighting against invisible chains, daring fate with every step. To see Simon was to see inevitability itself, fragile and fading, already marked by the shadow of his 30th year, though he had not yet reached it. And then one autumn, the whispers began again. It started with the bells. On nights when the fog lay thick and the moor swallowed the horizon, the villagers swore they heard the bells of the Talloway chapel tolling. Yet no one had rung them for decades. The chapel, long abandoned, leaned into ruin at the edge of the estate, its roof half collapsed, its doors chained shut. Still, the sound carried, low, mournful, too steady to be wind. Some claimed they heard 13 chimes, though no clock in the county bore such a count. Others spoke of shadows on the moors, tall shapes moving where no sheep grazed, where no men walked. Some said it was Elias, roaming restlessly. Others whispered of something older, bound to the land, at the tavern, voices dropped low as though speaking louder might summon what they feared. The Talloways themselves said little. Elias grew sharper, his temper fraying at the edges. Simon looked paler by the day, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. And yet those who glimpsed him in the village swore they saw a glimmer there too, the look of a man who had discovered something, though whether salvation or damnation, no one could tell. One evening, as the sun bled itself out across the horizon and the mist curled higher, Elias confronted his brother in the library. His voice, raw with desperation, carried through the halls. "You dig through bones and dust while death waits at the door. Do you think you sell outwitted with ink and parchment?" Simon, hunched over a ledger, lifted his gaze slowly. His voice was calm, but it trembled. "Perhaps death is not the question, Elias. Perhaps it is who calls it." Silence pressed between them, thick and unyielding. Elias turned away, but his hands clenched into fists. That night, the bells tolled again. The villagers gathered at their windows listening. Some crossed themselves. Some counted the chimes aloud. 12, then 13. No one spoke afterward. The mist felt heavier, as though it had weight, as though it pressed against the walls of every home in Ashwick. The following morning, a shepherd stumbled into the village with his face ashen. He swore he had seen Elias upon the moor, though not as a man. His eyes had glowed red against the fog. His shadow stretched long and twisted, and though the shepherd had called his name, Elias had not turned. By dusk, the tale had spread, and with it, a question none dared answer. Was it truly Elias, or something wearing his form? At the estate, Simon sat alone, his cough racking his chest, his fingers stained with ink. Before him lay a torn fragment of diary, one of their ancestors' hands. The words blurred, but a line remained clear enough to pierce him. The debt must be paid. The blood is the key. He closed the book with trembling hands, his breath uneven. And still, the bells tolled. Ashwick held its breath. The curse had come again, coiling itself around the last of the brothers. Yet for the first time in centuries, it was not merely death they feared. It was something worse, something that might not stop at the Talloway blood. The moors grew quieter. Animals fled the woods. Children no longer played near the streams. And above them all the estate loomed, its windows dark, its halls echoing with footsteps that no one claimed as their own. Two brothers remained, each caught in the web of a doom that had claimed every heir before them. One restless, defiant, willing to tear himself apart to escape it. The other is searching for truth in words older than himself, chasing knowledge that might be more dangerous than ignorance. The villagers waited, as they always had, for the curse to claim another, but whispers carried a deeper question now, one that reached even beyond Ashwick Sip's borders. Was it fate that hunted the Talloways, or something far darker? And if it was darker, how long before it turned its eyes beyond the family, beyond the estate, and onto the village itself? Tell me, do you believe a curse can be born into blood, carried like a shadow from one generation to the next? Or is it the living who keep such shadows alive? The year was 1892. Edward Talloway, age 29, walked the halls of a house that had outlived its builders. Each step echoed against stone and rotted timber, a hollow reminder that he remained, while the rest of his family had gone before him. The curse was no myth to him, no superstition whispered in the taverns of Ashwick. It was a chain of graves, each filled before its time. His father, dead at 28, pulled lifeless from the estate's mill pond, with lungs filled not with water alone but with something black, thick as ink. His elder brother found in a locked room, with his veins emptied onto the floor, though no blade was ever discovered. Before them, uncles and cousins lost in ways too brutal, too strange to speak of plainly. Edward did not need the villagers to remind him. He carried each death as though it pressed upon his shoulders. Now, with weeks until his own 30th birthday, he wandered the manor's corridors as if listening for footsteps not his own. The portraits of his ancestors lined the walls, painted faces too sharp, too alive. At night, when the candlelight flickered, their gazes seemed to follow him. Outside, Ashwick carried on beneath its veil of mist, a village of slate-roofed cottages and bent stone fences. It clung to the valley floor as though hiding from the shadow of the Talloway estate above. Its people lived with their backs turned to the manor, yet their tongues could not leave its name alone. Children were hushed when they asked about the family. Men muttered in the tavern. Women crossed themselves when the bells tolled at night. They spoke of the debt the Talloways owed, though no one could say to whom, or for what. It was not just death they feared for Edward. It was payment. Edward knew their whispers. He had heard them since boyhood, when mothers pulled their children away from him in the village green, when men stared too long and too darkly, yet he had grown used to it, resigned. A man born to carry the sins of his line, whether true or imagined. His only comfort was Clara Whitcomb. Clara, who had grown beside him in Ashwick, had never treated him as a thing to be feared. She had been there when his brother's body was carried down from the manor. She had pressed her hand into his when the village shunned him. Now, as a schoolteacher, she carried her own grief in silence. A fiancé buried 2 winters past, taken by fever. Her smile was softer now, her laughter quieter, but her presence remained Edward's tether to the world beyond stone walls and blood-soaked memories. On evenings when the air was clear, she would walk the moor paths to the manor. Edward would meet her at the gates, and they would sit in the overgrown garden, where ivy strangled broken statues. She listened when he spoke of the curse, not with mockery, but with quiet acceptance, as though his words were weather, inevitable, heavy, and true. "Do you believe it will come for you, Edward?" she asked one evening, her voice low, her hands folded in her lap. He looked toward the house, its windows black, its chimneys smoking faintly against the fog. "It has come for every one of us. Why should I be spared?" Her brow furrowed, but she did not argue. She only said, "And if it is not the curse, if it is something made?" Edward did not answer. He could not. Within the manor, nights pressed heavily. He lit candles in rooms where no one had walked for decades, listening to the groan of beams and the whisper of wind through broken panes. Shadows stretched across peeling wallpaper like fingers. He thought sometimes he heard movement. A door closing gently, a sigh in the dark, but when he turned, nothing remained. It was in those nights, alone with the silence, that Edward began to search. He entered the library first, where mildew spread across the spines of books that had not been opened in years. He lit the hearth, stirred the dust from the shelves, and laid out the journals of his ancestors. Ledger after ledger, diary after diary, he traced names, dates, causes of death. He copied patterns into his own hand. Always the same age, always the same abrupt end. But behind the deaths, he sought something deeper. Letters, prayers, confessions. The words of his great-grandfather Elias spoke most urgently. "The line is bound. The wax is sealed. We pay, or we perish." Edward read it again and again, his chest tight. Wax, bound. What did it mean? Days bled into nights as he worked. His fingers grew stained with ink, his eyes bloodshot from candlelight. Clara brought him food he forgot to eat, water he forgot to drink. She urged him to rest, but he shook his head. "If I stop, Clara, I die without knowing. I cannot know." The villagers noticed the change. They whispered of candlelight in the manor windows at all hours, of shadows moving through rooms long abandoned. Some said Edward was summoning what had cursed his family. Others swore they saw Clara slipping into the estate and pitied her for the love that chained her to a doomed man. One storm-lashed night, as rain battered the windows and wind moaned through the chimneys, Edward stumbled upon something. He had gone to his father's chambers, a place he had avoided for years. Dust lay thick upon the furniture, the air damp with the scent of rot. His father's Bible rested upon the bedside table, untouched since the drowning. Edward opened it. The pages crackled, brittle with age. Margins bore notes in his father's hand, verses underlined, prayers scrawled in ink that had bled with moisture. And then, within the hollow cut into the back binding, he found a scrap of parchment, folded tightly, as though hidden in haste. His hands trembled as he opened it. The letters were smudged, but the words were clear enough. The covenant of blood and wax. The candle flickered, guttered low. The storm roared outside. Blood and wax. Edward sat back, his breath unsteady, the parchment trembling between his fingers. Was this the debt the villagers spoke of? A covenant, sealed by his ancestors, binding the family to what? To whom? The house seemed to breathe around him, the walls shifting with the wind. He thought he heard the faint toll of the chapel bells, though no hand had touched them in years. 13 chimes, slow and deliberate. He closed his eyes, clutching the parchment, and whispered into the dark, "What did you do?" But no answer came. Only the sound of rain against glass, and the knowledge that his time was running out. The Talloway curse was no longer just whispers, no longer just graves. It was written, sealed, bound in blood and wax. And Edward, the last of his line, would have to decide whether to honor it or to break it. The days shortened as autumn deepened, and the Talloway estate seemed to groan under the weight of each passing night. Edward kept to the archives now, the dust and silence wrapping him like a shroud. He lit no more than a single candle at a time, its glow flickering against shelves of warped wood and boxes gnawed at by dampness. His father's hidden parchment had lodged itself into his thoughts, those 4 words repeating with every breath, the covenant of blood and wax. If there was truth to be found, it would be here, buried beneath centuries of paper and ink. The archives were not merely a room, but an entire wing of the house, forgotten by most. Doors sagged on rusted hinges, and shelves bowed under ledgers that few hands had touched since the 18th century. Edward traced them carefully, each volume bound in cracked leather, each spine marked by his family name. He sifted through them by candlelight, his fingers blackened with dust, until the pattern of his ancestors' rise began to emerge. The Talloways, once humble candle merchants, had ascended almost overnight to the rank of gentry. What had taken other families generations of toil, his bloodline had accomplished in less than a decade. By 1720, Elias Talloway, the first master of the manor, commanded more land, more servants, and more power than even the old noble families of Ashwick could rival. But the records did not align. Edward frowned as he studied the ledgers. Entire fortunes appeared in Elias's hand without explanation. Ships purchased, properties acquired, debts paid in full, all within weeks of a fire that swept through London's warehouses, destroying the businesses of Elias's rivals. The rumors, Edward realized, had not been mere village gossip. They had been history told in whispers. It was said Elias had been seen walking the streets on the night of the fires, his hands red with reflected flame. It was said he had returned home with his clothes smelling of smoke, his eyes gleaming as though he carried the fire itself within him. From that night forward his wealth had multiplied, his influence spread, and his family's doom, perhaps, had been sealed. Edward copied the passages into his own notebook, his pen scratching frantically as though writing could force sense into the madness. Clara found him there one evening, hunched over the desk, the candle nearly burned to nothing. "Edward," she said softly, brushing dust from a ledger with her hand, "you've not left this room in 2 days." He looked up, his face drawn, shadows beneath his eyes. "It stays here, Clara. I can feel it. The truth, it stays in these pages." Her brow furrowed. "The truth, or madness? You pore over every rumor, every whisper. Wealth gained overnight, does not prove curses or covenants. Men rise and fall by chance, by cunning, not by... She stopped herself, pressing her lips tight. Not by what? Edward demanded, his voice low, sharp. She sighed, shaking her head. Not by pacts written in blood, not by wax that remembers. Edward's hand stilled over the parchment. He stared at her as though she had spoken words she could not know. How did you, he began. I've heard you whisper in your sleep, Clara admitted gently. You call out to your father, to your brother. You speak of covenants as if they breathe. Edward's mouth went dry. He had dreamed of Samuel often, his elder brother's face pale and broken, his lips moving though no sound emerged. But lately the silence has given way to words. You will burn. That night, the dream came again. Edward saw Samuel standing in the corridor outside his chamber. His clothes were soaked through with blood, dripping onto the floorboards. His mouth moved slowly, painfully, as though each word cost him. You will burn. Edward woke up, gasping, sweat soaking the sheets, the image carved into his mind. His chamber was dark, but as his eyes adjusted, he froze. Wax. Melted wax traced the frame of his door, thick drips, as though candles had burned for hours against the wood, but no candle had stood there. None had burned. The next morning, Clara found him in the library, pale and trembling, his eyes darting to the door again and again. You must leave, she urged. Come to the village, stay with me, or with anyone, until your birthday passes. If the curse is real, you cannot face it alone. Edward shook his head violently. No. If I leave, I carry it with me. It isn't set bound to these walls. It is bound to us. To me, and the only way to stop it is to uncover what Elias did. Edward, Clara's voice faltered. She wanted to shake him, to pull him from the brink, but his expression had hardened. That night, the manor grew restless. Footsteps echoed in corridors Edward had locked, to doors groaned open and closed though no hand touched them. The servants muttered prayers under their breath and refused to enter the west wing after dusk. One swore he saw a figure pass through a wall, its form wavering like smoke. And always the wax melted upon door frames, on window sills, even upon the stair rail, as though unseen hands carried candles through the house in the dead of night. Edward followed the trails, but they led nowhere, dissolving into empty air. His dreams grew worse. Samuel returned each time, more pale, more ruined. Sometimes he lay upon the floor, his throat open, whispering still. Other times he burned, fire consuming his body, while his eyes remained fixed upon Edward's. You will burn. By the third week, Edward no longer slept at all. Clara confronted him again, her patience fraying. This obsession will kill you before any curse does. Look at yourself. You says thinner, hollow-eyed. You speak to shadows. You chase phantoms through empty halls. What truth could be worth this? Edward Sepp's reply was almost a whisper. The truth of why we die. Clara pressed her hands to her face, despair cutting into her, but she did not leave him. She could not. That night, Edward returned once more to the archives. His candle flickered as he pulled down ledgers from Elias's time, volumes bound in leather stiff with age. He turned page after page, columns of numbers, shipments, accounts, and then, at the very end of one book, his breath caught. A line, written in Elias Talloway Sibb's unmistakable hand. The wax remembers. The words swam before Edward's eyes, burning themselves into his mind. The candle guttered low, its flame quivering, and for the briefest moment, Edward thought he saw the melted wax upon the desk shift, not drip, not harden, but move, as though it lived. He shut the ledger with a violent crack, his pulse hammering, the phrase ringing in his skull. The wax remembers. But what and why? And if it remembers, does it also wait? The archives grew colder the deeper Edward searched, as though the air itself resisted what he unearthed. He worked by candlelight, the wax pooling thick across the desk, the flame trembling against the damp stone walls. For nights he had combed through ledgers, letters and scraps of journals, until at last the figure of Elias Talloway began to emerge. Not as the painted patriarch whose portrait hung stern and immovable above the manor's hearth, not as the dignified master of the estate remembered in Ashwick's brittle church records, but as something else entirely. Elias had not been born to greatness. He was a second son, unwanted, destined to live and die in the shadow of his elder brother, who was meant to inherit the candle shop their father owned. Desperation bled from his early entries, complaints of poverty, shame, envy. But then, midway through his journals, the tone changed. It began with the mention of a stranger. A traveler arrived, an alchemist, or so he called himself. He spoke of wax and flame, as if they were not tools but living things. He said the world could be shaped by what remembers fire. The handwriting, Edward noticed, grew sharper after that, more assured. Elias wrote of experiments by candlelight, nights spent dripping wax upon parchment, sealing it with blood. And then, in one passage, the words Edward had dreaded. He came at last when the moon was thin. The waxen man. His face was hidden, his voice a hollow sound, as though spoken through flame. I sealed the covenant. In return, our line shall prosper, but each heir must be given before his 30th year, else the wax shall melt the flesh of us all. Edward's breath caught as he traced the letters. The covenant, the blood, the wax. It was no metaphor, no rumor. It was written in the hand of the very man who had raised the family from merchants to gentry. He pushed back from the desk, his chair scraping hard against the floorboards, the candle guttered. His pulse hammered in his ears. When Clara entered the room that evening, she found him pale, his hands trembling over the open journal. "Edward," she said softly, "you have found something." He looked at her, his eyes burning. It was him, Elias. He made it. The curse. It wasn't such fate, Clara. It wasn't a chance. It was a bargain. He gave us to him. To whom? Edward swallowed. The word lodged in his throat, but he forced it out. The waxen man. Clara's face tightened. She stepped closer, taking the journal gently from his hands. She read the passage, her brow furrowing, her lips pressed thin. "This is ink on paper," she said finally. "A man sets fantasies, his superstition. Desperate men write desperate things. You cannot believe this." But Edward shook his head, almost violently. "The fires, Clara, the warehouses that burned, the fortunes that followed, the deaths, every heir, before 30. It is all here." Still she resisted. Her voice sharpened, "And you would stake your mind on whispers, on tales of a said waxen man sit. Edward, you are letting shadows consume you. It is grief, not truth, that you said chasing." But the villagers told a different story. When Edward brought his findings quietly to the tavern, whispering questions to men who had drunk enough to loosen their tongues, they nodded grimly. Yes, there had been fires. Too many, too sudden. And yes, in those nights people spoke of figures wandering the moors, figures dripping with wax, their faces obscured, their bodies shimmering in the glow of unseen flames. Old mothers recalled tales passed from their own grandmothers of wax that crept beneath doorways, of voices that hissed through candle smoke, of men who swore they heard footsteps behind them, though no one stood near, and always the fires followed. Edward returned to the manor, with their words heavy upon him. He grew gaunt in the weeks that followed, his cheeks hollow, his eyes bloodshot. He scarcely ate, scarcely slept. By night he sat hunched over the journals, convinced that if he listened hard enough, he could hear Elias's voice guiding him. But it was not Elias he heard. At first it was only in his dreams. Samuel, his brother, pale and broken, whispering again, "You will burn." But soon Edward began to hear it in waking hours. Breathing. Low. Labored. Just behind his shoulder. He would spin. Candle raised high. But the corridor stretched empty. Only the silence remained. Silence that seemed heavier for what had just filled it. Clara grew afraid. She found him pacing at night, muttering fragments of Elias's covenant under his breath. She pleaded with him, "Come away from this house. Leave the papers, the candles, the shadows. Whatever is here, it is not life. It is death, Edward." But he refused. "If I leave, the waxen man follows. If I stay, I may yet understand. And if I understand, I may end it." Her eyes filled with tears, but his resolve was stone. The manor itself seemed to grow darker. Wax appeared more and more, melted in thick rivulets down door frames, hardened upon stair rails, pooling in corners where no candle had stood. The servants whispered of it, frightened, some slipping away in the night and never returning. Clara came to Edward's chambers one evening, desperate to see him, desperate to prove to herself that he was still there beneath the obsession. She opened the door quietly and froze. The room was lined with candles, dozens of them. Some stood tall, others burned halfway down, others little more than stubs drowned in their own wax. The air was thick with the smell of tallow, the floor littered with hardened drips. The flames flickered as though stirred by an unseen breath. Edward sat in the midst of them, his face half-shadowed, his eyes hollow. "Edward," Clara whispered, "what have you done?" He looked up sharply, almost startled. "Done? Nothing. I lit none of these. They were here when I woke up." Her heart pounded, fear clawing up her throat. "You expect me to believe that?" But his gaze was steady, too steady. "I did not light them, Clara. He did." The flames shivered, as though stirred by something neither of them could see. Edward had not slept in 3 nights. His eyes, reddened and hollow, darted over the brittle pages of manuscript scavenged from Elias's study. Clara found him crouched upon the floorboards, half mad with persistence, his hands blackened with dust and candle soot. But it was not until the 3rd dawn, when his hand brushed against a plank that shifted under weight, that he unearthed the hidden covenant. The papers were wrapped in oilcloth, yellowed with age, bound with a string that had rotted to near dust. Edward carried it to the desk, and with trembling fingers, unwrapped his family's secret. The covenant was not merely ink and parchment. It was written in blood. Each stroke sunk deep into the vellum. The edges bore wax seals pressed with a sigil. Clara did not recognize, though Edward whispered it was the mark of a flame inverted, a candle burning from wick to base, devouring itself. As Edward read, his face blanched. The room grew colder with every word uttered aloud. Elias Blackthorne, patriarch, had been the first to strike the bargain. During the famine of 1692, when crops failed and livestock rotted in fields, he melted human fat into wax. Some were taken from the bodies of vagrants, others from the condemned. A candle was poured for each member of the household, its flame binding life and death in perpetual cycle. In return, the Blackthorne coffers swelled with wealth unnatural to barren land. Merchants found them favorable. Crops in their fields flourished though neighbors starved, and sickness passed over their kin. But there was a cost. Every heir born of the family would in time be consumed, some by fire, others by madness, many vanishing before their prime. Edward read this aloud until his voice cracked. Clara sat in silence, her hands clenched in her lap, until at last she whispered, "Then we are not cursed. We are bound." Edward's gaze snapped up, his eyes wild. "No, Clara. Bound things may yet be loosed. A curse is enduring, immutable. But a covenant," he pressed his hand against the vellum, as though feeling its pulse, "a covenant can be broken." For the first time, Clara saw not merely grief in her brother's face, but a fevered light. It frightened her more than despair. The following days were consumed by Edward's hunt for unbinding. He pored through Elias's diaries, into church records, even into volumes long hidden behind false panels. Clara begged him to rest, to eat, but he scarcely touched food. His skin grew sallow, his hands trembled constantly, and yet he labored on. The manor itself seemed to turn against them as he pressed deeper. Doors slammed in still air. Windows cracked though no stone had struck. Wax began to seep from between the panels of wood, thick and yellow, as though the house itself bled its secret into the open. At first, Clara dismissed these things as Edward's madness pressing itself upon her. She told herself she was exhausted, that grief made her weak. But then she began to see them too, the figures. They lingered in the corners of her vision, silhouettes that did not move like men. When she turned her head, they dissolved into shadow, but their presence was undeniable. Once, crossing the great hall at dusk, she glimpsed a figure seated in Elias's old chair, hands folded across its lap. She blinked, and the chair was empty. That night she did not sleep. The villagers, already wary of Blackthorn grounds, began to whisper of the happenings within. The butcher's boy refused to deliver meat past the gates. The maid fled without notice. When Clara went to the village herself for bread, women drew their children close, muttering prayers as she passed. "The house is not merely haunted," she told Edward that evening, her voice low as though the walls might overhear. "It is warning us. It does not want to be lost." Edward Sipp's hands trembled as he traced symbols in chalk across the study floor. "You think walls can hunger, Clara? That timber and stone plot against us? No. It is the covenant. It still breathes. And if it cannot be broken..." His chalk snapped in his hand. He did not answer. The night of the fire began like any other. Edward had found a passage in one of Elias's journals, a half-finished notation about unbinding the flame at its source. He became convinced that the ritual required extinguishing the covenant's fire with words of reversal, that if spoken correctly, the bound wax would release its hold. He lit a candle upon the desk, one he swore had been poured by Elias himself. Its light was soft, flickering against the walls. Clara stood behind him, her arms wrapped tight about herself. "Edward, wait. If you are wrong..." "I am not wrong," he interrupted, his voice frayed yet resolute. He began to recite, words in Latin, some Clara recognized from scripture, others twisted into unfamiliar cadence. His voice trembled, then steadied. The flame on the candle danced higher. At first Clara thought it was the draught, but then the fire elongated, reaching unnaturally tall, blue at its base, white at its peak. Edward did not stop. The wax began to run faster than heat could explain, spilling over the desk in rivulets. It dripped onto the floor, sizzling where it touched the chalk lines. The symbols hissed, dissolving as if burned away. Clara cried out, reaching for Edward's shoulder. His skin was cold, though sweat poured down his brow. His lips kept moving, faster now, almost consumed by the words. Then the candle split. Not melted, split. Its wax cracked down the center, and from within, a new flame burst forth, untethered from wick or air. It clung to the desk, spreading in arcs like fingers reaching. The fire burned without smoke, without heat, yet the wood beneath it blackened. Clara seized Edward, pulling him back as the desk ignited. The flames leapt not as fire, but as living things crawling up the legs, spreading across the planks. "Edward, stop," she screamed. "It will take you." For a moment he seemed entranced, eyes locked upon the fire, lips still moving soundlessly. His face reflected the glow, not golden, but pale as bone. Only when the flames licked at his coat did he stumble backward, collapsing into Clara's arms. Together they dragged away, as the desk collapsed in embers. But when the flames reached the edges of the room, they did not spread further. They guttered, dimmed, then sank back into the single candle, which stood once more whole upon the ruined desk, its flame small, steady, innocent. Edward lay gasping, his voice hoarse. It feeds, it will not yield. Clara stared at the candle, her body trembling. For the first time she believed utterly. This was no madness of Edward's. The house lived, the covenant breathed, and it would consume them both, if it must. When the room was finally still, the candle burned on. Its wax dripped slowly and steady, as though nothing had ever happened. And in the silence, Clara thought she heard a whisper, not from Edward, not from her own lips, but from the flame itself. One more heir. One more life. The covenant holds. They said the covenant began not with blood, but with fire, a flame caught in wax, hardened and carried into the dark. Yet every record Edward found spoke in fragments, as though the truth had been melted and reshaped, just as the waxen man reshaped flesh and time itself. Clara had warned him, as had the villagers, as had his own failing body. But obsession has a way of deafening the ear to reason. The storm had not lifted since the night of the bells. Ashwick was a town suffocating under its own silences. Doors closed early, candles burned late. Mothers pulled their children away from Clara as she passed, whispering that no good could come from keeping company with a Talloway. They claimed to have seen her silhouette at the graveyard, kneeling in the rain. They claimed Edward's shadow walked longer than his body allowed. They claimed too much, and yet not enough. Still, within the parish archives, amid brittle parchment and moth-eaten ledgers, Edward and Clara uncovered what they had been seeking: the name Matthias Quill, an alchemist of the 17th century, banished for attempting to harden the soul into wax. His experiments, whispered of in the margins of trial records, spoke of transmutations not of metal into gold, but of life into permanence. Souls sealed, spirits molded, fates bound as if poured into a mold. He had vanished, the records claimed, into Ashwick's marshes, carrying his instruments and tomes, and with him vanished a chapel, swallowed by the fen one night, as though it had never stood. "Do you see?" Edward rasped, fingers trembling over the page. "The covenant began with him. With this quill, the marsh still holds him, and perhaps the waxen man himself. The pattern ends only where it began." Clara wanted to believe him, but as she watched the firelight stutter against his hollowed cheeks, his lips stained red with each cough he stifled into a handkerchief, she wondered if he could endure even one more night. His body was betraying him as surely as the family curse had betrayed every Talloway before. The villagers knew it too. When Clara went into the town square the next morning for bread, the baker refused her coin, pressing the loaf into her hand with downcast eyes. "No Talloway survives 30, he whispered. "Not when the one who waits beneath grows restless." She tried to ask who or what that was, but he only shuddered and closed the shutters against her questions. That evening the manor felt less like a home and more like a tomb awaiting its occupant. The wind pressed against the windows, but the air inside was still, thick with the smell of extinguished tallow. Edward had spread the records across the dining table, his ink bleeding into the parchment where sweat from his trembling hands soaked through. Clara had just set down a fresh lamp when she saw it. Figures. Small, pale figures, no larger than dolls, lined across the table. At first she thought they were forgotten toys, relics of children long gone. But as she drew closer, she saw the detail. The eyes carved hollows, the mouths sealed shut, the forms fragile wax, sculpted with unsettling care, and each bore a name carved faintly at its base: Talloway. One by one, generations of heirs stood there in miniature, wax effigies awaiting flame. Clara froze as the nearest began to sag, wax running like tears down its face. Another followed, then another. Each figure, in its turn, melted before her eyes, collapsing inward as though consumed by invisible fire. Edward staggered to his feet, breath rattling, "It is a warning," he said hoarsely. "He knows we seek him." But Clara's gaze caught on the last effigy. Its likeness was sharper, crueler in its accuracy. The same jawline, the same posture, the same thin lips set against a cough, and as it began to melt, Edward fell to the floor, choking on his own breath, blood bright against the pale wax at his feet. Clara screamed his name, rushing to his side. His body convulsed, his eyes rolled white, and for a dreadful instant she thought the Covenant had claimed him there and then. But as the last of the wax figures collapsed into a puddle, the fit broke. He gasped, chest rising and falling shallowly, his skin clammy and pale as death. She pressed a cloth to his lips, wiping away the blood. "Edward, please, stop this. If you keep pushing." He caught her wrist with surprising strength, his eyes fever bright. "If I stop, then I have already lost. Do you understand? This curse, this covenant, it has devoured my father, his father, all the way back to the first who signed their soul away. I will not be another name whispered in Ashwick's taverns. I will not let the waxen man decide when I die." Clara wanted to argue, but there was nothing left to say. His will was fire, and fire burned even as it consumed. She held him as he steadied himself against the table, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the walls. The storm outside grew louder, as if the manor itself was under siege. Candles flared, sputtered, then burned higher, their flames drawn toward the windows. In the glass, Clara thought she saw a reflection that did not belong, a tall, faceless figure, its head bowed, its form tapering into dripping wax. It stood behind Edward, patient, waiting, as though amused by his defiance. And then, just as suddenly, the vision was gone. Edward, breath ragged, but voice unwavering, set his hand against the records. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we go to the marsh, to the chapel, to Quill. I will end this, Clara, even if it ends me." His words lingered in the silence, a vow against the dark, but beyond the manor walls the marsh winds carried a sound like distant weeping, as if the one who waits beneath had already heard. The marsh stretched before them like a graveyard drowned in its own sorrow. Edward had always thought the air in Talloway heavy, but out here among the reeds, the air itself seemed to rot. Each step sank into sucking earth, each breath coated the lungs with damp bitterness. Fog curled low across the pools of stagnant water, as if the marsh exhaled a ghost of its own past. Clara led the way, her lantern held high, though its light seemed weak against the ever-thickening mist. Edward followed, boots heavy, heart heavier still. He had spent nights with the Covenant etched in his mind, wax, blood, and words spoken against the silence of the manor's walls. The bargain Elias had made was no prayer but a trap, written not for salvation but for possession. And now, guided by rumor and dread, they sought the ruins the villagers would not name aloud. The first sign of the chapel came not as stone, but as sound, a faint dripping, rhythmic as a clock, yet no rain had fallen in days. The air cooled further, and Edward's skin prickled as if a breath pressed against his neck. Clara stopped short, her lantern beam trembling across a broken line of stones half buried in mud. Beyond them, the marsh widened into a pool, and there, rising from its belly like a blackened ribcage, stood the ruin. The chapel was not whole. Its steeple had collapsed into the mire long ago, its roof sagged, eaten by rot. Walls leaned at angles unnatural, as though the marsh itself sought to swallow them whole, but had not yet decided on the final gulp. Vines as pale as veins wound through shattered windows. What remained of its door hung crooked, and beyond that threshold, Edward swore he could already smell wax burning. "Do you hear it?" Clara's voice was scarcely above a whisper. He nodded. The dripping had grown louder. Not water, something thicker, something slower. They stepped inside. The air was close, suffocating, and upon the altar, or what passed for one in this ruin dripped streams of wax. Candles stood unlit, their wicks black with age, yet molten rivulets fell steadily as if unseen hands poured them fresh. Pools gathered on the stone floor, cooling into shapes that resembled faces mid-scream. Edward bent closer, eyes wide. "No flame," he muttered. "No fire at all. And yet—" "The Covenant breathes still," Clara said, her words tasting more like resignation than fear. On the altar's surface, inscriptions had been carved deep into stone. The grooves ran slick with wax, filling letters Edward could not fully translate but recognized in part. Bargains, promises, warnings. It was no chapel in truth. It was a temple of terms, a reliquary of debts. The waxen man, the inscriptions told, was neither god nor demon. He was what men made him, a guardian bound only by words etched in wax and sealed in blood. He took no soul unless it was freely signed away. Yet once written, once lit, the bargain was eternal, until broken in equal offering. Edward Sip's hands shook as he traced the grooves. "Ilias," he breathed. He knew. He bound his line in wax and blood. He thought himself master, but he was only one more debtor. The wax on the altar pulsed faintly, as if alive, and Edward snatched his hand back. Clara's face had gone pale, eyes fixed beyond him. "Edward," she whispered. He turned. The shadows of the chapel had lengthened, though no sun reached here. In the deep recesses where water seeped through stone, faces began to form, first pale, then clearer. Men and women, some young, some old, their mouths opened soundlessly, and Edward knew them, or rather their portraits. The heirs of Talloway, all of them. One by one, their hollow eyes stared past him, lips shaping warnings that no air carried. Clara clutched his sleeve. "They want us gone." "No," Edward said, forcing steadiness. "They want it broken. Look at them." And indeed, not all mouths formed words of dread. Some pleaded, some begged. One woman lifted a translucent hand as though pointing to the altar itself. The visions thickened until the air pressed heavy with their presence. Edward's chest grew tight. He staggered back, stumbling on the wet stone. A chill rose beneath his boots. Then suddenly, the floor gave way. The marsh had been waiting. Water surged upward through the cracks, dark and cold, swallowing his legs before he could draw breath. Clara cried his name, but already unseen hands gripped his ankles, pulling him down with force beyond human. He thrashed, clawed at the altar's edge, but wax slicked his palms. The whispers of the heirs grew frantic, their mouths wide in silent screams as Edward's head slipped beneath the water. The world vanished into green-black. Silt clouded his eyes, hands clamped his arms, his chest, his throat. It was not drowning alone he feared, but the thought that the marsh itself meant to take him as it had taken the others. Wax streamed past his vision in ribbons, burning though it was water, not fire. He tried to pray, but the marsh forced silence down his throat. And then a light. Clara's lantern. Above, wavering, frantic. Her hand plunged through the water, reaching. Edward kicked, twisted, tore himself upward against the grip of the dead. His lungs burned raw. He caught her wrist, slender, desperate, stronger than he'd ever known it to be, and she hauled with all her weight. The hands beneath him did not relent, but Clara's strength and his own panic together ripped him free. He broke the surface with a scream that was half breath, half terror. He coughed marsh water until bile rose in his throat. Clara dragged him back from the flooded stone, away from the altar's reach. They collapsed against the crooked doorway, gasping. "Never again," Clara said, voice raw. But Edward cut her short, clutching the fragments in his hand. At some point in the struggle, he had broken part of the altar stone free. The shard glistened, its surface marked with both blood and wax where he had gripped it too tightly. He held it up between them, and though the visions had faded, he felt their weight linger. "This," he whispered hoarsely, "this is the key. If the bargain was bound in blood and wax, then so must it be burned. Not prayers. Please do not modify it. Fire. Fire. Alone." Clara's eyes searched his face, uncertain if his determination had crossed into obsession, but the wax still dripped, and the ruin seemed to breathe, and there was no denying the truth of what they had seen. Together, soaked and trembling, they stumbled back into the fog. Behind them, the chapel seemed to sigh, a sound like hundreds of voices exhaling at once. The dripping did not cease, nor did the whispers. But Edward clutched the shard as though it were salvation itself. And somewhere in the marsh's depth, the waxen man stirred. The storm had broken over Hollowfield with a violence that rattled the very bones of the estate. Rain lashed the windows, and the old timbers groaned as if remembering every secret that had ever been buried within its walls. Inside, Edward moved with restless urgency, gathering implements for the ritual he had sworn to complete. His hands trembled, not from indecision, but from the weight of lineage pressing down upon him like a shroud. He had uncovered the covenant, traced its bloody history, and named its monstrous warder. And now, at last, he would stand against it. The great hall had been stripped bare of its ancestral trappings. Furniture lay overturned, draped in canvas, as though even the house wished to avert its gaze. On the flagstones, Edward traced the sigils with melted tallow, the smell of scorched wick clinging to the air. The symbols glistened faintly, as though pulsing with a life of their own, eager to drink the blood that would soon feed them. At the circle's center lay the covenant itself, an ancient scroll sealed in crimson wax, its letters shifting when he tried to focus on them, as though mocking comprehension. Clara lingered at the threshold, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders. She did not step across the chalked lines, but her eyes never left Edward. Her presence was a quiet anchor. She was not heir to this curse, nor bound to its bargains, yet she had chosen to stay. That choice alone steadied him more than all his studies of occult rites and ancestral testimonies. But even her gaze could not shield him from the tremors that rippled through the house. Shadows thickened at the edges of vision. The sconces along the walls burned lower, their flames sagging and stretching, dripping wax down the stone as though weeping. And then the wax began to stir. It flowed not downward, but upward, recoiling from the floor to the ceiling, pooling together in a grotesque mass. From that mass stepped the waxen man. He was no longer an echo glimpsed in mirrors or the corner of a candle-lit room. He was fleshless but formed, his body a grotesque sculpture of molten wax that glistened with a perpetual half-melt. Each movement made him sag and reform, as if eternity itself had trapped him between states. His face was neither human nor mask, but a blank oval with rivulets for eyes, streams of wax cascading like tears that never ceased. The air reeked of tallow. The floors shuddered beneath his weightless steps. Edward Sepp's throat tightened, but he raised the dagger nonetheless. "You are no guardian," he whispered, though his voice betrayed the tremor in his heart. "You are a parasite, feeding upon fear." The waxen man tilted its formless head. From its hollow mouth spilled a voice like candles guttering in a draught. "I am covenant. I vow, without me there is no house of Harrow. Yield heir, and you shall be eternal." The words clung like grease to Edward's ears, promising relief from doubt, from mortality, from the crushing duty that had haunted every Harrow heir. For a moment his arm faltered. Could it be true? Was this thing not an enemy but a keystone? To strike it down might collapse not only the curse but the family itself. It was Clara who saved him. Her voice cut through the oppressive air. "Edward, you are not your forefathers. You are not bound to their bargains. You can choose." Something in her steadiness, something achingly human, burned brighter than the waxen man's promises. Edward exhaled, steadied his grip, and cut his palm. Blood welled, hot and vivid, falling onto the wax-drawn sigils. They hissed as though alive, flaring into red-gold light. The waxen man recoiled, its body sloughing and bubbling, but the retreat was short-lived. With a surge it poured itself forward, engulfing the circle's edges, forcing Edward back step by step. Its whispers sharpened, becoming Samuel's voice, the voice of his brother who had died under the Covenant's shadow. Edward, the spectre breathed, and from the wax rose Samuel's likeness, carved in dripping form. His eyes were familiar, his mouth trembling with the agony of remembrance. Do not resist. Death is mercy compared to what comes otherwise. I begged for release, and I was given only this half-existence. Spare yourself. Edward staggered. His brother's face, though warped and molten, was undeniable. Guilt gnawed at him. He had lived where Samuel had not, carrying the weight while Samuel had fallen. For a heartbeat, the dagger wavered in his grasp. Clara crossed into the circle. The flames licked her skirts, but she did not flinch. She placed her hand against his bloodied one, grounding him in warmth. Samuel's voice is not his own, she said, her words low but fierce. Would your brother beg you to yield, knowing it meant binding others to his torment? Or would he urge you to finish what he could not? Her certainty cracked the waxen illusion. Samuel's likeness melted, dripping into the formless mass once more. The spectre howled, not in his brother's tones, but in the gurgling, guttering voice of the wax-born thing itself. The manor answered in kind. Candles burst into wild flame, as though ignited by unseen hands. The walls themselves sweated molten wax, pale rivers streaking down the paneling, until the portraits of long-dead heirs seemed to weep blood. Their eyes, once dull oil, glimmered wet and watchful, condemning Edward's defiance. The floor shuddered. The roof boomed with thunder. But Edward pressed on. He raised the Covenant scroll above the circle, his blood smearing its surface. The waxen man surged higher, a wave of burning wax threatening to consume them both. Its whispers grew frantic, now offering power, lands without famine, wealth without loss, dominion beyond generations. It promised him a throne carved from eternity itself. Edward's voice, though shaking, rose over the storm. I refuse. He thrust the dagger downward, piercing the scroll and binding it into the circle with blood and flame. The reaction was immediate. The circle blazed, fire consuming not only the sigils but the very air around them. The waxen man shrieked, its form unraveling in violent streams, its body collapsing into rivulets that sloshed across the stone before igniting in liquid fire. It clawed at Edward, but every strike passed through the rising inferno. The manor itself convulsed, windows shattered, raining glass, beams split. Every portrait cried red until the walls looked soaked in slaughter. But Edward and Clara stood fast within the burning circle, their silhouettes unwavering against the chaos. At last, the waxen man collapsed into a heap of burning wax, its body writhing as it was consumed. From the flames came one final whisper, pitiful and venomous, "Without me, you are nothing." Edward answered only with silence. The Covenant burned in his hands, its wax seal melting, its words curling into ash. As it crumbled, so too did the last anchor of the waxen man. Its scream fractured into nothingness, leaving only the roar of fire. When the silence finally fell, Edward and Clara stood alone before the Covenant's ruin. The manor was engulfed, flames climbing the walls like ivy, licking the rafters, consuming centuries of rot and memory. Yet at the heart of it, within the circle of blood and wax, the two figures did not falter. The Covenant had burned. The waxen man was undone. But whether the curse itself had ended, or only transformed into some darker shape, remained unspoken. For now there was only the fire, and the sound of the house collapsing around them. And in the glow of that ruin, Edward whispered, almost to himself, "So be it." The fire had left Greystone hollow in ruins, Blackened timbers still smoked days after the flames had died, their skeletal frames reaching upward like grasping arms. The Covenant's lodge, once a place of ritual and secrecy, lay in charred collapse, its stones cracked by heat and its altars shattered. For many in the village, the destruction was a sign of liberation, an end to generations of whispered bargains and candle-lit ceremonies. But for Edward Talloway, liberation was a word he could no longer claim. He had survived the inferno, pulled from the brink of death by Clara's desperate hands, yet the moment he opened his eyes, he felt the truth gnawing at his bones. The waxen man had not perished with the flames. If anything, the fire had only made it stronger. It followed him now, an unseen shadow pressing at the edge of every room. His body weakened each dawn, as though his very years were burning away like wicks. His once steady hands trembled. His breath came short, and the closer he drew to his 30th birthday, the heavier the presence became, until the air itself seemed weighted with molten wax. Clara would not rest. She scoured what remained of the Talloway records, piecing together the brittle remnants of journals, ledgers, and Elias's hidden letters. For days she read by candlelight, her lips moving as though in silent prayer. Edward, too weak to stand long, often watched her from his chair. She carried the weariness of grief in her eyes, but she pressed on as if sheer will might keep him alive. One night she looked up from a yellowed scrap of parchment, her face pale as winter bone. "Edward," she whispered. "It was never Elias who gave himself, not fully." He stirred, voice hoarse. "What do you mean?" Her hand shook as she held up the paper. "He did not end the covenant. He bargained for his bloodline. He bound his descendants in his place. That is why it has never let you go. Why never let your father, nor his father before him, rest. It never ended, only passed on." Edward closed his eyes. In truth, he had always known. The nightmares, the voices, the feeling of his life being measured not in years but in debts, it all aligned too neatly. Clara Stead's voice cracked. "But there is more. To end it finally, a Talloway must offer themselves willingly. No trickery, no substitution. Only a choice, freely made. That is the law, Elias carved into the pact." For a long time Edward said nothing. The fire's faint glow through the broken windows cast his face in gold, highlighting the hollows beneath his cheekbones. At last he spoke. "Then it ends with me." Edward Clara's protest cut through the silence like shattered glass. He turned to her, the trace of a smile ghosting his lips. "Do you not see? This was always my path. All the suffering, the shadows, the whispers, they have been leading here. I will not pass this curse to another. I will not let the waxen man claim another child, another heir. It ends tonight." Tears welled in Clara Sepp's eyes, anger and grief wrestling in her chest. "You cannot simply give yourself to it. You shall be erased. Nothing left, not even a grave." "Better nothing," Edward said softly, "than everything taken." That night, as the clock struck midnight, and his 30th birthday began, the chamber grew heavy. The air thickened, cloying with the scent of hot tallow. Candles guttered, though no wind stirred. Then it came. The waxen man seeped from the shadows, its form twisting upward until it dwarfed the rafters. Its body was faceless, a column of dripping wax that hissed as it struck the floor, limbs elongated, stretching like softened candles, and from its chest came a sound, not words but a groaning, as though every extinguished wick in the Talloway line moaned in unison. Clara gasped, stumbling back, clutching a rosary though no prayer left her lips. Edward, however, did not retreat. He stepped forward, his legs trembling but resolute. The waxen man leaned closer, molten drops burning holes into the wooden floorboards. Edward dropped to his knees. "I am Edward Talloway," he said, his voice steady, despite the terror clawing at his throat. "I give myself freely, not out of fear, nor coercion, but choice. This ends here. This ends with me." The waxen man's faceless head tilted, as though regarding him. Wax pooled around Edward's knees, scorching the skin, but he did not cry out. Instead, he lifted his eyes to the void above him. "You will take no more. My blood is the last." The entity shuddered. Its dripping slowed. For a moment, the entire room felt suspended, candles frozen in their flicker. Clara's breath caught in her lungs, even time itself holding back its march. Then, with a sound like 1,000 wicks extinguished at once, the waxen man bent forward. Its molten form enveloped Edward in a crushing embrace, its wax cascading over him in streams of fire and ash. Clara screamed, rushing forward, but a wall of heat flung her back. Edward Sepp's voice echoed, muffled but resolute. "On my own terms. It ends." The waxen man convulsed, its body collapsing inward, folds of wax sucking into itself, as though the creature were being drawn back into the void from which it came. Edward's form dissolved within it, consumed, but his words lingered in the air, vibrating like the final toll of a bell. When the last remnants of wax struck the floor, the chamber fell silent. The smell of smoke faded. The air lightened. The waxen man was gone. And so was Edward. Clara fell to her knees, sobbing, her hands blackened from clawing at the scorched boards where he had stood. Yet amid her grief, she knew, for the first time in centuries, the curse had broken. The Talloway line was no more. The chamber breathed like a living lung, every corner filled with the hiss and pop of burning wax. Shadows clung to the ribbed ceiling, their movements unnaturally fluid, as though the walls themselves were alive and shifting. Clara pressed herself against the cracked stone archway, heart pounding, breath shallow, her eyes fixed on Edward. He stood before the waxen man, his frame outlined by the unholy glow of molten light spilling across the floor. The creature towered above him, a grotesque parody of flesh and manhood, built from the waxen forms of generations past. Its limbs dripped molten streams that hissed as they struck the flagstones, searing black scars into the floor. Within its featureless face flickered hollow recesses, like eyes yet not eyes, openings into a depthless hunger. And from its chest, shapes protruded, faint impressions of faces, the long-dead Talloways, their mouths forever half open, in silent cries. Edward's breath trembled as the weight of it pressed upon him, an ancestral terror older than his own bones. The air thickened with the scent of scorched tallow and burned marrow. His legs should have faltered, his voice should have broken, yet something had shifted within him. Where once the chain of fear had bound him, now there was something steadier, a stillness rising from deep resolve. The waxen man leaned forward, a sound emanating from it like the groan of old wood under strain, and Edward's head snapped back with a jolt. He staggered, eyes rolling upward as though a hand invisible had torn open his mind. Clara cried out his name, but her voice cracked against the heavy air. She could not move. Her body refused her, frozen in place, as though the very wax that crawled across the flagstones held her in invisible chains. All she could do was watch as Edward's pupils clouded, his expression slackened, and his breath caught in his throat. And then the vision seized him. Within the darkness of his own mind, Edward stood not in the chamber of Blackwood Manor, but in a world where the walls bled light, and the floor rippled like water. Before him stood a man, sharp of jaw, clad in the heavy coat of a bygone age. His eyes glittered like oil catching fire, and though his skin sagged with death's touch, the sneer upon his lips carried with it both cruelty and pride. Elias Talloway, the ancestor whose greed had summoned the first binding, the one who had bargained flesh for permanence, power for survival. His shadow stretched impossibly far, drowning the vision in a cold, seeping dark. So Elias whispered, his voice echoing with disdain, "The blood runs thinner with every generation. Look at you, trembling, frail, a flickering candle in the gale. I forged eternity, and you would end it in surrender." Edward Sepp's fists tightened at his side. His knees threatened to buckle beneath the weight of his forebear's scorn, but he forced himself upright, shoulders squaring. His voice broke first as a whisper, then strengthened as it carried through the vision. You call it strength to chain your sons to terror. You call it eternity to feed our bodies to that thing. But this is no legacy. It is rotten. It is a curse dressed in your pride. And his voice rang louder, echoing even against the waxen chamber beyond. I will end it, not as a frightened heir, but as the last Talloway. Elias's sneer deepened, splitting into laughter that rolled like thunder. Yet within that laugh was fear threaded sharp and bitter. Edward's vision snapped, his body collapsing forward as the waxen man loomed closer, its dripping hand extended, molten rivers tracing its fingers. Clara tried to scream, tried to run to him, but her limbs would not obey. All she could do was sob into her own silence as Edward lifted his face. He did not flinch. He did not run. He spread his arms, defiant, as though embracing death itself. Take me, he said. Take me, and let it end. The waxen man moved with terrible slowness, its body creaking as wax sloughed from its limbs. It enveloped him. The molten hand pressed against his chest, then his shoulders, then his face, with a hiss like rain striking fire. Edward's flesh ignited. Clara's throat tore with her scream, though no sound emerged. She watched helplessly as flame devoured him, his skin blistering, his bones trembling within the inferno. Yet Edward stood silent, eyes locked upon the void, lips forming words Clara could not hear. His body trembled, but did not break. The waxen man pulled him close, folding around him like wax poured into a mold. Edward disappeared within its molten bulk, consumed utterly. For a moment the chamber filled with a blinding light, white gold, unbearable. Clara shielded her eyes, tears burning her cheeks as the fire's roar filled every crevice of the manor. And then silence. The waxen man stilled, its movement ceased, the dripping slowed, then stopped. Cracks tore through its body, splitting the waxen flesh like dry earth under sun. From those cracks darkness seeped out, curling smoke without flame. The faces pressed within its chest faded one by one, their outlines dissolving until there was nothing. With a sound like shattering glass, the waxen man collapsed inward, wax melting to nothing, air rushing to fill the vacuum it left behind. The chamber was still. The suffocating stench lifted, replaced by the cold, damp smell of stone. The molten rivers across the floor hissed once, then retreated, vanishing as if they had never been. The heavy air cleared. The pressure that had held Clara immobile released her, and she collapsed to her knees, breath tearing raggedly through her chest. Where Edward had stood, there was only scorched stone, no ash, no body, no trace. Clara's scream broke free at last, echoing in the hollow chamber. It was not just grief. It was the sound of a heart being torn from its cage, of love and loss bound in one terrible moment. She dragged herself forward, hands scraping against stone, searching desperately for some remnant of him. But there was nothing. Her sobs filled the silence that followed. The manor itself seemed to sigh. Its endless groans, its whispering walls, its unseen movements, all of it quieted. The air grew still, eerily calm. Somewhere above, the storm that had battered its windows slowed, thunder retreating, wind dying to a whisper. Edward was gone, but perhaps, the curse was gone with him. Clara fell forward, forehead pressed to the scorched flagstones. Her body shook, grief racking every muscle, every vein, yet beneath the crushing sorrow lay the faintest glimmer of hope. His sacrifice had not been in vain. The waxen man has ended, the Talloway curse extinguished in fire. Or so it seemed. As her sobs faded into hollow silence, Clara felt something stir, not in the room but within herself. A pressure, faint but unmistakable. The air at her back thickened, prickling against her neck, as though unseen eyes lingered still. She froze, breath caught. The chamber was silent, the manor still. From somewhere deep within its bones, a sound shivered through Blackwood's walls. A whisper. Not loud, not clear, but enough. Enough to remind Clara that curses rarely end so cleanly. She rose slowly, unsteadily, her body trembling with both terror and grief. She looked once more at the spot where Edward had been consumed, her lips forming his name like a prayer she dared not speak aloud. Then she staggered toward the archway, unsure if she was leaving behind salvation, or only the echo of a horror waiting to wake again. Weeks later, Clara Talloway stood before the blackened husk of the family estate, the skeletal remains of what had once been the pride of Ashwick. The walls were charred and brittle, standing like mourners in a graveyard, their windows hollow sockets staring into nothing. The great gates leaned inward, twisted by fire, as though they too had been bowed beneath the weight of the curse. The smell of scorched wood lingered, faint but unyielding, like smoke that clings long after the flame has died. Villagers gathered at a distance, whispering. Their words traveled in threads of rumor, weaving themselves into the wind. Some claimed the curse had finally lifted. No shadow clung to the ruined halls, no wax seeped from the stone, no echo of unholy chants filled the air. Mothers dared to walk past with their children, and men returned to fields once abandoned. Ashwick had begun to breathe again, yet every pair of eyes flickered to Clara, and in each glance she saw both pity and suspicion. The curse was gone, they believed, but curses never vanish cleanly. Someone must always pay. For Clara, the cost had a name. Edward. His absence hollowed her. Where once his presence had been a steady anchor, now there was only silence, an echoing grief that haunted every step. She could still see his final moments in the flicker of her memory. His face illuminated by the unnatural glow of the burning wax, his body consumed by the family's dark inheritance, his sacrifice sealing what his forebears had lost. He had damned himself to free others, and in doing so left Clara behind. She pressed her hand against the gate, the iron cold and unyielding. Ash scraped her palm, a sting that grounded her in the present. The estate was hers now, at least in law. She had inherited ashes, broken timbers, and a history steeped in blood and wax. Solicitors had arrived days after the fire, presenting her with deeds and documents, letters sealed in envelopes that still smelled faintly of candle smoke. She had not opened them. What was paper compared to grief? What use was inheritance when its foundation was rot? Clara turned from the gates. She would not live there. She could not. As she walked away, her thoughts unraveled like threads. Ashwick's cobblestones echoed beneath her boots, each step taking her farther from the Talloway line. She thought of Elias, the ancestor who had bartered away his family's future for power. A man who had believed his legacy was worth more than his soul. It was he who had invited the curse, binding generations in wax and flame, feeding greed with blood. Edward had been the final offering, the last to burn so that others might live free. But Clara knew the truth. Curses are not always supernatural. They are choices that echo across time, bargains made at the expense of others. Elias had damned his name with his hunger. Edward had redeemed it with his death, and Clara, the last of the line, bore the weight of both. The villagers watched her pass. Some nodded, grateful, though their gratitude was edged with fear. Others crossed themselves, muttering prayers, as though the curse might yet cling to her hem. Clara did not meet their eyes. She no longer belonged to them, nor to this place. Ashwick was a graveyard, and she was its last mourner. Days later, she packed what little she owned and left. The road stretched ahead, grey and endless, winding between fields that had once been sickened by shadow, but now showed the first signs of green. The world outside Ashwick seemed lighter, though Clara carried her darkness within her chest. She travelled alone, and in silence. At night, in distant inns, she dreamed of Edward. She saw him standing in the firelit hall, his voice steady as he whispered her name before the wax consumed him. She woke each time with her hands clutching at emptiness, the sheets damp with tears. In the quiet of those rooms, she asked questions with no answers. Had his sacrifice truly ended it, or had he merely delayed the curse, pushing it further down a road yet to be walked? Was the estate truly dead, or did something still linger in the soot and ash? Clara did not return to Ashwick to find out. She could not bear the thought of walking those halls again, hearing the echo of Edward's footsteps where none now existed. The estate would rot, its stones crumbling into the earth, its gates rusting into silence. Let it vanish, let it be forgotten. And yet curses have long memories. One autumn evening, a traveller passing through Ashwick found himself at the ruins. He had heard whispers in a tavern of the cursed estate, of the fire that had cleansed it. Curiosity, that most dangerous of human instincts, led him through the broken gates. He saw charred beams, walls cracked with age, and rubble thick with soot. But what caught his eye was the glimmer of something half buried near the hearth. A candle. Its surface was streaked with ash, but it was whole, untouched by flame. The traveller plucked it from the debris, smiling at his find, a relic of the infamous Talloway curse. He thought of selling it, perhaps, or simply keeping it as a curiosity. That night, when he made camp, he lit it. The wax burned with a brightness that was not natural. The flame shimmered, tall and steady, casting shadows that moved against the walls of his tent, even when the air was still. He leaned closer, entranced, watching the wax drip in rivulets that glowed faintly in the dark. And then he heard it, a whisper. It was faint at first, a thread of sound curling from the flame. He thought it was the wind, until the voice shaped words. The wax remembers. The traveller froze, his breath caught, his skin prickling cold despite the heat of the candle. The whisper came again, closer this time, as though someone stood just behind his ear. He turned sharply, but no one was there. Only the flame, burning brighter now, the wax pooling at its base. Shadows moved, stretching, shifting, forming shapes that looked almost human. Faces half-formed flickered in the tent walls, mouths opening in silent screams. The traveller tried to snuff the candle, but the flame would not die. He pinched it, smothered it, even doused it with water, and still it burned. The wax climbed the wick in reverse, feeding itself upward, defying nature. And the whisper grew louder. The wax remembers. Somewhere, beyond the reach of mortal sight, a curse stirred again.